Alright, good morning. Today we're going to be looking at the voting rights of the United States. The issue with the voting rights is that the Constitution never clearly defined what it meant to be a qualified voter. And therefore, since it's not in the Constitution, the requirements to vote are left up for the states because of the 10th Amendment. And this has created an issue over time because obviously voting is something that the federal government relies on and that is an essential part of democracy, but who gets to vote can be tricky. So the Constitution does not clarify the specifics, therefore it is left up to the states. If the government, the federal government I should say, wants to really define anything about voting, they have to make a constitutional amendment, which is why there are so many amendments in the Constitution that are about voting. Take a minute and try to think of the voting amendments that you can list. Are you thinking? Okay. Let me help you out a little bit. Let's see, just starting from the beginning, you have the 15th Amendment, allowing any race to vote. The 17th Amendment changes the way we vote for our senators. The 19th Amendment allows women to vote. The 23rd Amendment gives Washington, D.C. votes towards the president. The 26th Amendment changes the voting age to 18. I skipped the 24th. That outlaws poll taxes. So there are, somewhere around 5-6 amendments that all deal with voting, and that's because it's not in the Constitution, so the individual states have to handle this unless they add a constitutional amendment, which they have done a number of times, but even after adding amendments, we'll see that there were a couple of problems. Originally, the only people who could vote in the country were guys like Thomas Jefferson here. White dudes over the age of 21 who owned property. The first 6 presidents of the United States were all elected by essentially crusty old white dudes who owned land. To kind of put this in perspective, I just bought my house last year. I'm 33 years old. So for 32 years of my life, I would not have been an eligible voter under the old system. Now, most states got rid of that policy by themselves. There was never an amendment saying that you could allow non-property owners to vote. But, if you rented a house or rented an apartment, you didn't count. You had to actually own the deed to property to vote in the beginning stages of our country. Then, obviously, half of our population, or actually more than half of our population, are women. And women's suffrage saw a very, very long fight. It began at a convention in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. This is before the Civil War. Women got together and discussed how it was not right that they did not have the right to vote. The women at Seneca Falls wrote the statement called the Declaration of Sentiments, and it was based off the Declaration of Independence. And essentially what they said was, the Declaration of Independence says we were all created equal, but half of us aren't. And then in the Declaration of Independence, they said, he has done this, he has done that. He was King George III in the Declaration of Independence. And the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments, he was mankind, men, what they have done to women, not allowed them to vote or own property or work meaningful jobs. And so this movement for women equality really began at Seneca Falls in the United States in 1848, but it still takes a very long time. It's not until the 1920s when women's suffrage actually comes to be, 72 years later after the Seneca Falls Convention. Now, some states, since the states could determine their own voting requirements, some states like Wyoming did allow women to vote earlier. Wyoming was the first, and that's actually one of the things they take pride on in their state, is that they allowed women voters in 1869. The reason for that being, they're on the frontier. There's no women's jobs and men's jobs. Everybody felt that they had to pitch in to make things work on the frontier. And so if women were willing to move out to Wyoming, they wanted to make it as appealing as possible. Moving out west was predominantly a man's, job, not a man's job, but what men did. Men were pioneers. It was very difficult to get women out. So anything they could do to make it appealing for women to move out west was attempted. And so some states did allow women voters well before the 19th Amendment. America also is kind of behind the curve in the world. Some countries in the world, such as Great Britain, allow women voters in local elections much, much sooner. But the first country to have universal suffrage in the world, meaning both men and women can vote in every election, was New Zealand in 1893. And the United States finally gets women's suffrage in 1920 after World War I. So the fight for women's suffrage took quite a bit of time, and it's more recent. There's been way more years in American history where women couldn't vote than women can vote. All right, the 15th Amendment, which was passed after the Civil War, was meant to allow any race to vote. But in reality, the fact that states could define their own voting requirements kept this from really happening for close to a century. This picture is a political cartoon describing the conditions in the South following the Civil War. And you'll see that there's the Klansmen, right? And there's this member of the White League, which were these, racial superiority groups, and they're looming over the freed African Americans. You'll notice one of them is being lynched in the background. The reality of the situation is that following the Civil War, things did not improve. In fact, this makes the statement worse than slavery. And in some ways, I don't know that it would be worse than being enslaved, but in many ways, the South did not improve for African Americans following the Civil War, and some could make the argument that it was actually worse because of the intimidation and violence that occurs to prohibit African Americans from voting. So the 15th Amendment was supposed to allow any race to vote, but it still was not popular amongst white people in the South. It was ratified without any Southern states approving of this constitutional amendment, and so when it goes into effect and they rejoin the Union during the Reconstruction following the Civil War, there's a large degree of backlash. And one of the first responses are hate groups such as the KKK will use intimidation and lynching and violence in order to scare away African Americans from voting. And to a great deal, this is successful because the law doesn't stop the Klan from doing this very much. The police officers are white. Some of the police officers would be Klansmen. So this intimidation existed for quite a long time and really scared away many of the African American voters from registering or voting. Also, since the state could make its own voting requirements, there were other legal loopholes that existed. For example, some states made up grandfather clauses, which said you were only eligible to vote if your grandfather was an eligible voter. So following the Civil War, all the freed African Americans, their grandfather couldn't vote, so they can't vote. And that means their children won't be able to vote, their grandchildren won't be able to vote, so on and so forth. So they really found the loophole in the 15th Amendment because it said, you couldn't deny people the right to vote based off of race, color, or previous servitude. Didn't say anything about your heredity. It didn't say, your grandparents. So they really found tricks to keep black people from voting. Literacy tests were also used, and these literacy tests could be racially biased. At first, literacy itself would be a challenge. It was a crime to teach slaves how to read. So in the years following the war, if you couldn't read, you couldn't vote. So that would prohibit many African Americans in the South from voting. And then as literacy became more commonplace, they made these, tests racially biased. So a white guy comes to vote, they'd be like, all right, before you can vote, you got to answer this question. Who's the first president of the United States? Yeah, George Washington. Great, you get to vote. Then the African American comes up to vote, and it's like, who is the seventh president of the United States? I don't know. Well, sorry, you can't vote. It's not fair to make somebody know George Washington compared to Andrew Jackson or somebody even more obscure. You could ask him who's the 15th president of the United States, and it'd be Buchanan. But so these literacy tests would prohibit legal voting as well. And then you also had poll taxes in existence, a fee to vote. If people are coming out of slavery, they don't have a lot of wealth to begin with. So to make them pay a fine to vote would, turn away at many African Americans in the South from voting. So obviously we have a constitutional amendment about poll taxes, but these grandfather clause and literacy tests and the KKK and the voting intimidation was something that was very difficult for the country to get around and to deal with. And really, even though the 15th Amendment went into effect, it took a long time for voting to really be realized by every person in the South. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, and in reality, many black Americans did not have the right to vote, especially in southern states, until the 1960s. So almost a full century later. If you listen to Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, he's talking about equality and the end of segregation, and there are many social things that are going on at that time. The end of segregation is something that he's fighting for, but another essential thing is the idea that voting should be equal. And, the Constitution said that for a long time, since 1870, but the reality was African Americans weren't being able to vote. So one of the major accomplishments of the Civil Rights Movement and of Dr. King in general was the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1963. And essentially, it made it a federal crime to use these sorts of voting discriminations. Literacy tests, grandfather clauses. It also created a federal system where you could go to the national government to register to vote. And this was a way to bypass some of that intimidation from the KKK and other, hate groups. So the Voting Rights Act of 1963 was a major deal in the Civil Rights Act and one of the great accomplishments of Dr. King. One of the other accomplishments of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s was the Civil Rights Act that basically outlawed segregation and discrimination in the workplace. So that tried to deal with some of the social issues of that. But for this unit, we're more concerned with the Constitution and the status of voting rights. And the Voting Rights Act of 1963 was one of the major accomplishments for Dr. King. So, voting today, we have added numerous amendments to the Constitution about voting. Obviously, 18-year-olds can vote. Any race can vote. Women can vote. Voting is supposed to be free. But there are still a lot of questions and issues that exist about voting status. Some states have challenged the constitutionality of the 1963 Voting Rights Act that Dr. King had passed. And right now, some states are saying that it's outdated, that states wouldn't be racially, discriminatory anymore, so this law should go away. And they've also argued it's not really constitutional because voting requirements are not a delegated power; they're a reserved power. And so many states have been talking about, abolishing the Voting Rights Act. I think that if I were African American, that would be a scary thought to me. Do you trust your state to be fair with its voting practices still? Maybe you would feel that they'd be fair, maybe you wouldn't, but if it's constitutional or not. That argument does make sense that it might not be constitutional, but obviously it serves a pretty important purpose of making sure that all American citizens are eligible to vote. There have also, in recent history, been a lot of question over voter identification and voter registration, where a lot of states want you to bring in some sort of state-issued identification to vote, to basically verify who you are. And that makes a lot of sense. You want to make sure that people aren't double voting or there's not voter fraud going on. Some people have also argued that it is discriminatory, however, because poor people are less likely to have a state-issued ID card, and especially poor people living in urban areas. If you're poor and you live in Chicago, there's a good chance you don't own a car because you don't need to. There's public transportation, there's things like that, so you wouldn't have a state-issued ID card, which means if you tried to register to vote, you would not be able to vote. And so a lot of people think that these voter identification laws are, racially motivated in some cases because, the vast majority of people who are poor and living in cities are minorities. And so some of these voter identification cards are seen as a way for, to disenfranchise some voters from having their suffrage rights. There's also been a number of efforts to increase the number of voters. Probably one of the most successful laws in modern history, in recent history about voting, are motor voter laws, where if you get your driver's license, you can register to vote at the same time. And this is what Mr. Bear has done to register to vote. Now, you can register to vote other places, the post office, the courthouse, but the motor voter laws makes it very convenient because almost everybody worries about their driver's license. Now, the problem with some of these motor voter laws are that you get your driver's license when you are 16. You don't have to renew your license until, I don't know if it's 20 or 21. And the problem is that since you didn't have that option when you were 16, a lot of 18 and 19-year-olds never register to vote until they renew their license. So there's a couple-year gap where you're driving, but you're not able to vote, and then you might turn 18. If you don't go back and register to vote or renew, you wouldn't have registered, so you would not be able to vote. Some countries around the world use compulsory voting, which I believe I spelled wrong there, my bad. But compulsory voting is basically requiring people to vote. Australia tickets people, fines them if they don't vote. There's some wisdom to that. We should get the will of the people. Personally, I don't know if that's a great idea because the average voter might not be informed on who they're voting for. So compulsory voting is an interesting idea. As a civics teacher, I think everyone should vote, but I think they should vote after they know what they're talking about. I think everyone should inform themselves to make a conscious decision. If you just require people to vote, it's almost like a punishment. So I don't know if I personally would agree with Arizona's or Australia's compulsory voting laws, but it is an interesting idea. And others say that voter turnout is very poor. Only about 50% of people who could vote in any election actually show up. And there's a variety of factors for that. People are apathetic, people are uninformed, people believe that their vote doesn't really matter, and in some situations, maybe it doesn't. If one candidate was going to win in a landslide anyway, your one vote is less likely to matter. So there is some truth to that fact, but one solution people have said to possibly increase voting turnout is, you have compulsory voting, but also maybe election day should be a holiday, that people should get the day off work. Now, every state is supposed to allow their employees some time to go out and vote during the workday, but a lot of people feel that that's not possible or that's an inconvenience. So some have said we should have a voting day holiday, but so far that doesn't exist. Maybe sometime in your lifetime. So that is the history of voting rights in America. Essentially, you have a huge conflict because the Constitution never defined voting. And since it's not defined, it's left as a reserve power. Over time, we've seen as a country a need to expand voting rights to more people. The only way to do that is through constitutional amendment. There have been a couple of federal laws that have been put forth, such as the Voting Rights Act, but people challenge that the Voting Rights Act is even constitutional, so it still becomes a statewide issue, and this has created a vast source of conflict in our country and its history. It has led to the disenfranchisement of millions of Americans for centuries of time, and it's something that citizens need to be aware of and to continue to be vigilant about. All right, so long story short, a lot of people fought for the right to vote. You should make sure you practice your elective franchise, and when you turn 18, register to vote and inform yourself and vote.